Hello, welcome. Give everybody a second to hop on. Feel free if you want to turn your cameras on, or you can leave them off if you prefer. I would love for this to be a dialogue, so type in the chat and feel free to comment throughout. All right. My name is Jennifer Ferrante. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist out of Tulsa. And so today we're going to talk about dissolving the illusion of ego. And this can be a kind of tricky subject because there's so many definitions of what ego might mean. And I want to start with that. So let's talk about what we might mean when we refer to ego today. So I'm looking at this from a perspective as a hypnotherapist, as someone who studies Jungian psychology. I'm looking through the lens of human design and gene keys. And so I want to examine ego as a synonymous term with separation. So if I say and describe ego as a feeling of being separate from source, does that make sense and resonate with everyone? We can understand that definition? Okay. So I want to take you back and do a quick visualization to start this off. And I want you to just close your eyes for a moment. And I want you to imagine being inside of your mother's womb. And regardless of your current relationship with your mother, there was a time that you knew that connection, that you knew what it was to be completely connected and dependent and one with another being. And then through that process of birth, we experience for the first time this feeling of disconnection. And as infants and as children, separation anxiety is very real. It has an effect on our nervous system. And we know internally that something is wrong when this disconnection begins to form, and this feeling of being disconnected to our first source, our first love, our first parent. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we work today through the layers of ego, because it's so subtle how quickly we form these layers. And I want to take you back to my own birth story to kind of share my very first layer of ego. Because when I was born, there's a story about my birth that earned my nickname from my dad, and my nickname is Bright Eyes. And the reason my nickname is Bright Eyes is because when I was born, I apparently lifted my head, looked around at the full room of everybody in the hospital, and smiled. And the nurse told my parents, it's quite abnormal for an infant to be able to lift their head up and look around. So my dad called me Bright Eyes and always have. So that's the first piece or label that I took on to myself. And it was a connection point with my parents. So when I think about Bright Eyes, I think about my connection point with my dad. And when I sit in that role, in that label, in that identity, I have this connection with my father. And then when I was in my crib as an infant, I can actually visualize. I visualized the dust coming through the window that was next to my crib. And I can visualize the plaque that was on the wall above my bed. And it had my name on it, which was Jennifer. And underneath it had my name meaning, which meant fair lady. And there was a Bible verse. And that Bible verse said, she clothes herself with dignity. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. And that was another layer of my identity that I took on. And that plaque I still have in my home now. And it formed a very important piece, as our names do, of our naming, our meaning making, and our identity. And so many greats define the ego differently. And Carl Jung considered the ego a crucial part of our being, but also a very limited aspect of the self. So it was a piece of the self, but not the self. And growing up in a Christian home, there was a term that I heard a lot, which was to be of the world, or to be in the world, but not of the world. And so I like to think of that when I think of the ego, because it's an aspect of our experience, but it is not us. We are not of it, but we experience it in the same way that we can experience time in our everyday experience and still know it's a construct. So how can we see the world around us as this beautiful construct, this Maya that we live in every day, and yet we're not bound by it? We aren't controlled by it, and we can dissolve it when it serves us to step back and examine why we've built the pieces of our identity and of our ego that we've selected and chosen. So that's what we want to look at today. So in the comments, I would love for you to just jot down, what do you think of when you think of ego, and specifically dissolving the ego? Does anyone come with any kind of preconceived notions of what that might mean, or how the ego feels when you think about that as a concept? So I asked this question, suffering into salvation. Yeah, I can feel that one. I asked this question on my Facebook page, preparing for this, and some of the identity pieces that people gave, I thought I wanted to bring here because they might really resonate. The wounded healer was one that someone brought up as a piece of identity. Another shared that they define themselves by some of their physical limitations and health illnesses that they had, or their mental illness that they may struggle with. Ego feels scared to dissolve itself. Okay, yeah. And that's really, there's some nuance there as to how do we dissolve the ego? Is it active or is it passive? So dissolving the ego, is it something we have to do? Or is it something that happens when we relax into and understand where it forms from? So I want to look at Jung and his philosophy behind the ego. And he defined different aspects of self. And the ego he defined as the center of consciousness. And then he had that separate from the persona. So often we can use those terms interchangeably, but the persona he defined as the masks we wear. So it's something that we put on as a role. It's something that we put on as a mask. That might be me saying, I'm a mother of 7. I'm a hypnotherapist. Those are labels and roles that I play, but they don't define myself. But there's some really deep subconscious beliefs that we hold about ourselves that we believe to be true. And these are things that we experience usually in our childhood from the ages of 0 to 8 that form that subconscious belief about who we are at our core, what our essence is. And so these might be beliefs like, because I grew up in the church, a deep belief that I had was that I am wretched and I come into this world needing a savior. And I see that in a different light. Now I hold absolutely no heaviness around remembering believing that. And it was my path and my entryway into where I am now. But that was a core belief that developed between the ages of 0 and 8, that when I pull that out and tease that out, it's not a role or a mask. It was a subconscious deep belief. So I want to read through some of your comments here. So used to think it meant being conceited. Yeah, that's a common belief about ego, that maybe it's pride, egocentrism, or egotistical, a sense of something we need to battle because there's pride attached to it. But at its core, if we look at the ego as that knowledge or awareness of separation, we can understand why we build these egoic layers to feel more connected. So I want to give you an example. One of my mom's favorite poems, and my mom was really big on story. She read us lots of books as a kid. She loved poetry, Robert Frost and E.E. Cummings. And her favorite poem was called I Am a Nobody. by E. E. Cummings. And it goes like this. I am a nobody. Who are you? Are you a nobody too? There are two of us. Shh, don't tell. They'll banish us, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog. To tell one's name the lifelong day to an admiring bog. And there's so many elements in that poem that exactly address what we're talking about today. Because on the opposite pendulum swing side of trying to get rid of the ego and believe we are nobody, sometimes we can find identity even in that. And look at all those others who maybe are less awakened or less spiritual or less ego driven, and see that separateness and create even more of a feeling of separateness. So it's interesting that often the labels that we take on in order to feel connection with something and someone. And so I'm a lifelong lover of personality systems. I love human design. I love Gene Keys. I love Myers-Briggs. Anytime you can sort people into a system, every part of me just lights up because I want everything to be so organized and neat, right? It just fit into these things because what it creates is a sense of belonging. And so when we individualize, when we put these labels to ourselves, what we're actually hoping for is usually connection through disconnection. And so by saying maybe I'm an INFP, are there any other INFPs in here today? So like we are one, right? We are the INFPs, and those ENFPs, too extroverted, right? I can be extroverted behind a camera like this, but if you saw me in a group, I'd be very quiet. So we have these senses of self that then we try to find our tribe. We put on these layers of ego so that we can actually connect. And in doing so, we're creating this disconnection because we're othering what we don't feel we are. And so you may find that different labels that you've taken on in your life has helped create a sense of belonging or a sense of connection in certain spheres. And we certainly feel it at an event like this when there's people who we know are like-minded and we get to discuss things that maybe in our regular circles, nobody would have awareness of or know what we're talking about, but here we can talk about it. And it connects us in this way. And yet we could take that to its extreme and feel very disconnected from those who don't share our beliefs, share our labels. And that's where we can examine these today and kind of soften into the labels that we take on. We can look at why we formed them. Ultimately, as a hypnotherapist, what I notice is that we create labels as a result of a dysregulated nervous system, and our nervous systems that are looking for connection, when they feel disconnected, they get dysregulated. And so through co-regulation, through regulating the nervous system, our need for labels and identity can fall away and soften, and we can feel more connected to things outside of what we use as our own labels and our own identity. So we've looked at Jung, and I want to move on to another really influential person that I've studied in my life, and that's Rudolf Steiner. So when my children were younger, we did Waldorf schooling, and I was really into Steiner's philosophies. And he looks at the ego very differently. And it's fascinating because he defines human development in 7-year cycles. And one of the things that he works to prolong for as long as is possible is that sense of connectedness for infants and for children. So the classrooms in a Waldorf environment are very womb-like. All of the colors are soft. They aren't taught to read until much later and to reason with the conscious mind until much later, because the years of 0 to 7 are kind of a protected womb space of childhood. And yet he considers this process of individuation as milestones. And the way that we see that physically in the body is when our teeth are finally permanent, when we get our permanent set of teeth around the age of 7, he sees that as cementing the self into the human experience and deciding to stay, because in his belief system, between the ages of 0 or 7, they're in and out of the astral and in their body, and not always in their body. And so around the age of 7 or 8, that's when that permanence becomes to set in, and the permanent teeth set in as a physical manifestation of that. And that's when that identity really starts to form, as the critical mind begins to start meaning making and labeling. So if you ever get a chance to explore Steiner and some of his theories, he has really interesting perspectives on the ego and how it can serve us and how it can also really limit. And so most of the philosophies that I've studied hold that kind of view, where the ego can be an important aspect of being human, and yet it's a limiting aspect, because the second you label something, it becomes limited. And we can do this by naming things, naming feelings, naming emotions. We can do this by making meaning out of things that happen to us in our everyday life. And there's a story, I was trying to find the book before this class. The book is called Wandering Through Eden, and it examines 3 different Eastern philosophies. And in one of them, the master's teaching, and he pulls out a rose. And he holds it out for his disciples to come forward and look at the rose, ultimately to give the rose to one of his followers. And they all step forward offering different meaning making. Oh, that's a beautiful rose. It has the scent of this. It reminds me of this. And finally, one steps forward and just smiles and experiences the rose. And that's who he hands the rose to, because the rose got to be experienced in its least limited form. And that's something that we can think of when we think of the labels and the beliefs and the subconscious patterns that we choose to bring into our lives as potentially limiting factors versus experience. So we're also going to do some somatic work and kind of experience where we feel these things in our body, just through the felt experience instead of verbal meaning making. Now I want to move on to Richard Rudd, who I just geek out about with Gene Keys, so we could get really deep in that. But I actually want to refer you to one of his videos, because it goes way deeper than I can go into today. But he describes the spiritual ego, and I'll put that link in the chat later. But if you just Google probably Richard Rudd spiritual ego, he outlines 18 common traps for the spiritual ego, and it's really eye-opening. It's a beautiful kind of self-analysis tool to be able to see clearly what traps we may be falling into ourselves, and he humbly shares his struggles with those as well. And so he speaks of the ego as part of the shadow frequency. So if you're familiar with the Gene Keys, there's 3 stages in this progression of evolution, and the shadow stage is not seen as the stage to avoid. It's seen as the springboard to get to the city. And you get there through the path, which is the middle way. And so there's the gift at the center, the shadow, and the city. And so he views the ego as those anchors or those attachment points that point us towards what our higher self really values. So things like fear as a shadow. We could see that and want to kill fear. But if we look and examine our fear, it usually points an arrow at what we most value. And so if we can really engage with that, the shadow, the ego, and what that can show us, it can show us our higher self, our highest version of ourself, and what we're here to learn. And so that's the way that Richard Rudd kind of speaks about the ego. And I love that. And for that reason, I wanted to examine Gene Key 47, which I'm going to give you as a free gift at the end. So I'll put that in our chat at the end. There's going to be a link for a hypnotic journey through Gene Key 47. It starts with the shadow of victimhood and oppression. And that's a common egoic subconscious belief that many of us, if not most of us, in some form hold. And we move through victimhood to transformation and ultimately transmutation. It's a really beautiful Gene Key. So I'll share that later for you to kind of explore. Richard Rudd, there's a quote by him saying, "The ego dissolves not through force, but through love." And that's really how he approaches the shadow for each of the cities, because for those who have certain gene keys in their profile, if you just look at all the shadows, it's a real sad picture. But if you look at your cities, you see the beauty that comes out of that starting point, that doorway, that springboard. And so it's a really loving way to be able to view what we probably often take on through our experiences and our trauma to create connection in our life. And it can really be a beautiful arrow to show us what our higher self is here to learn. So then I want to move on to Gabor Mate, who's kind of more of a contemporary psychiatrist. I'm not positive which he is, so I don't want to speak for him, but you can read a lot of books by him, and he looks at the ego as a trauma-born strategy. And so that's one view that we're going to look at the nervous system with, because often when the nervous system feels unsafe, we adapt, we take on layers that are protective layers and walls that become layers of ego that we use to protect ourselves. And so we want to see that with love to be able to dissolve those, because a common work that I do in my office, either in person or remote, is looking at these subconscious beliefs that we hold. And maybe it's victimhood, and maybe in our childhood we truly weren't safe. Through that, lovingly, our body creates protection. And sometimes that protection takes the form of dissociation, because discomfort and pain, it's loving that our body disconnects from it in that moment. And sometimes it's hypervigilance, noticing everything around you, because you have to be very aware of your environment in very traumatic experiences. And trauma doesn't have to be catastrophic. Trauma is subtle. Trauma is coming into the world and being separated from your mother. Trauma is crying and not having your need met. And the most well-meaning mother at some point experiences that with their child. And so it doesn't have to be catastrophic. Trauma happens to everyone, and we all take on protective layers to deal with it through our life. And so when we look at the ego through the lens of the nervous system, we can understand why we create certain patterns, we use certain habits, and why when we get to a place where we come out of those maybe unsafe environments, our body still holds that programming. And so that's one of the things that we really work to untangle: the patterns of hypervigilance, the patterns of people pleasing, the patterns of whatever it is that to keep you safe, you learned to keep connection, and ultimately to avoid that feeling of disconnection, because it's a spiritual principle of connection and disconnection that we're just seeing in the material world when that happens in our life. And our soul knows that something's not right about that. And so it creates these walls, these protective barriers, and these strategies to keep us safe. So I want you just for a second to stop and feel into your body, and maybe think about what your most current most present form of either self-preservation or ego pattern that you might notice today, and where it sits in your body. And then just drop that in the chat, because we're going to work with that for a second. Where does that sit in the body? For me, I'm always working with hypervigilance. So for me, hypervigilance sits in kind of a, like up here in my head, feels like heat, gut, okay? Fear of survival in my shoulders. Yeah, we hold a lot in our shoulders, hips. Any other ones? And then we'll kind of we'll choose one to feel into. Stress in the jaw. Yeah. Often we don't even realize we're holding it, right? Until we become aware of it. And then we realize we've been tight for a really long time. Yeah. Okay, everybody shake out your jaw for a second. Shake out your shoulders. Neck too sometimes. Okay. All right. Where might we have been holding tension that we didn't notice it before? So wherever you notice that in your body, I want you to isolate it. We're going to take 3 really deep breaths into that space. And as we do that, I want you to repeat with me kind of a mantra for right now, which is just in this moment, I'm safe to release this protectiveness. So just in this moment, sometimes our lives don't feel safe, but just in this moment, we can. So just in this moment, I can feel safe to release this protectiveness. Just in this moment, I need nothing to be connected to others. Just in this moment, I have complete access to my source. Just in this moment, there is no need for separation. So one more deep breath there. Noticing anything that comes up for you around that. Sometimes this can bring our awareness to other areas of the body. So sometimes doing this practice will create an awareness of maybe another area that's connected. Sometimes it will bring up an old memory. So we store memories in our body, and doing this practice each day of kind of body scanning where we might be holding those protective layers that day. It might lead us to a memory that's tied to that area of maybe a time when that was necessary. And a phrase that I really like to use for myself and for my clients is, it makes so much sense that. So when things like that start to come up and we have those memories of maybe needing to protect ourselves in some situation, or needing to adapt or do something that now we look back at and feel like we're in a different place of, it makes so much sense that in that moment, my body responded that way, or I felt that way. And so we can do that in the morning and just kind of move to each area that our awareness brings us to. Maybe it starts in the neck, maybe it moves to our hips, maybe it moves to our feet. But we can do that body scan and breathe in to that area with, just for this moment, it is entirely safe to let out all of that tension and all of that protective tightness that we hold without even realizing it. And so that's the physical layer of the mental and emotional processes of creating all of those layers for ourselves. And so I want to take you on a little bit of a hypnotic journey today. I was really hoping I could get the music set up for this, but it's just not going to come through today. So I do have that link. I'm going to talk you through it, and we're going to do it without music. But I have that link for you. And so the page that I'm going to give you the link to at the end of today's class, it's going to have your bonus materials. It's going to have your bonus offer. And it's also going to have that link to the recording. So if you really want to go deep with this and do this practice later with headphones in isolation, I encourage you to do that, because each time you work with either guided meditations or hypnosis, new layers come up to the surface. So that'll be available for you to use as frequently as you want after this class is over. But go ahead and get comfortable. And you can lay down, you can sit up, however you're most comfortable. Or laying down. You can choose to keep your eyes open, or you can close them. So allowing your hands to rest gently. letting your shoulders settle. You're going to begin to notice your breath. So as you inhale, I want you to draw in gentle light. And as you exhale, breathing it out like a fog or a mist. So breathing in, gentle light. And breathing out. And as you breathe, you might begin to feel that familiar sense of sinking, of drifting inward, as if your awareness is gently peeling back from the surface of the material world, sinking even deeper inward. And we're going to take a bit of a visionary journey. So I want you to really open up to the parts of your brain that want to imagine and play. Because some of the greatest healing happens when we play. So imagine yourself walking down a corridor. There's old stones underneath your feet, and you can feel them as you walk barefoot. There's velvet curtains lining the walls. And there's a hush, quieter than quiet. And so you come to a heavy wooden door. And that heavy wooden door has a brass handle that feels cool against your skin. And as you turn that handle and step inside, it opens to an enormous chamber. And this chamber is dimly lit, quiet. And all along the walls, there are hooks and hangers, shelves and racks. And on them, there are dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of cloaks. And each and every one is unique. Some are tattered. Some are extremely extravagant. Some are hideous and hidden behind all the others. And somehow, you know that each cloak represents an aspect or a layer of yourself that you've worn. And so as you walk through this room slowly, stop and let your fingers brush the sleeves. Maybe taking a minute to remember the version of you who wore it, the age, the story, the role. Maybe it was a childhood Halloween costume that for the first time made you feel brave. Maybe it's very structured and you wore it to feel like a protector. Maybe it's very simple with really nubby textured fabric. And putting that layer on made you just feel calm and like everything was simpler than it could feel like it was in life. Maybe it's bedazzled and you put it on to play a role and feel more confident. But now you notice a central platform. And in its center, a warm golden flame flickers gently in a ceremonial bowl. And one by one, you're invited to remove each layer, to fold them, to honor them. It makes so much sense that you put those on when you did. But now you can release them into the flame. And as each cloak dissolves, you can feel a thread of memory release with it, integrated. And as you remove that final layer, there is pure light that remains. And there may be emotion behind removing the layers, or there may be smiles of gratitude and beautiful memories. And at the far end of the room, you notice a tall, ornate mirror, framed in silver vines. Its glass shimmers. And as you step closer, you don't see a costume or a role. You see you before the cloaks, beneath the masks, even before you knew the word you. And maybe you're surprised at how familiar that looks, how incredibly radiant. And as you look into this mirror, you can feel the memory of original self rising like a tide. And at this point, if you want to place a hand over your heart, you're welcome to just welcome this memory once again, this remembrance, this knowing. And the flame at the center glows brighter. And from its light, a new transparent layer emerges as a garment of truth. And you might choose to wear it now, or just hold it in your awareness. And as you do, you feel the room shift. The echoes of everything you've ever been, now released not as weight, but as wisdom, as love. And so you turn once more towards the door. Lighter, clearer. And with each breath, you begin to return, remaining inside of you, that feeling, the original spark. Breathing in, that clarity, breathing out, that feeling of connectedness. And as I count from 1 to 5, you can return fully. 1, becoming aware of your body again. 2, feeling your hands, feeling your feet, anchoring down deep into the body. 3, taking a slightly deeper breath. 4, noticing how the space feels around you. And 5, opening your eyes and slowly taking a minute to integrate and sitting up or getting more comfortable back in our space. And if you have a drink, feel free to take a drink. Okay. So I'm going to show you real quick if I can share my screen. I'll show you a page that I'll give you a link for. Let me see if I can screen share. Yeah. Yes. So hopefully you can see my screen there. So if you go to Ferrante Family Wellness /Awakenpedia, you'll see the banner for this event, so you know you're in the right place. And I have your free gift there for Gene Key 47 transmission that you can listen to at that link. I also have the retreat replay. So this is the mixed with music version, because music does add a lot to get into the hypnotic state. I use binaural beats, I use frequencies and a lot of different things with the music portion of hypnosis. So you'll get to experience that as well. And then if you scroll down, you see my promo code there. So Awaken 20 for 20% off your first Zoom one-on-one coaching. And you can apply that to anything. If you want to do a Gene Keys session, we could do Gene Keys. If you want to talk about parenting in teens, we can do that. We can do hypnotherapy. So that applies for all my services that are remote. So you can access that all at that page. Let me see how to stop share here. Oh, thanks for coming. This was fun. I got to think through a lot of things and put it into a concise form. So I loved the experience. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Cam. Thank you, Maddie. And thanks for all your tech help, Maddie, trying to figure out the music. I wish I could have got that figured out for you guys. All right. So you're welcome to reach out to me if you think of questions later. You've got my webpage, and there's that bonus offer that you should have in your materials. So I'd love to follow up and hear from any of you. Thank you.